Well, all right. Welcome everybody to another episode of Hot Seat Automotive Podcast. It's your buddy CJ here. And tonight we're talking about all things automotive industry, all the things that automotive enthusiasts love talking about. Cars, cars, cars. Listen, this is the place to be for that real gearhead talk. Real gearhead talk. Guys, welcome back to all of my subscribers. You know your buddy CJ loves each and every one of you. I'm so grateful for all the growth, all the activity and interaction and growth around the community, around the channel. Hit me up on Instagram, Hot Seat Gearheads. Guys, we're having a lot of fun. If you're new, give me a like and subscribe. All are welcome here. We talk about cars, exotic cars, muscle cars, classic cars, automotive events, motorsports. We get into it all. Come on, we have a lot of fun around here with your buddy CJ, lifelong car guy and gearhead, just like you. Folks, let's go ahead and get right into it tonight. Not going to waste any time. Got a special episode, something very near and dear to my heart. And if you're a gearhead, if you're an automotive enthusiast, this is going to resonate with you. And I want to hear your comments because tonight we're talking about the real story behind the Buick Grand National. We're going to get into some of the history of this iconic muscle car and performance car, how it was a great disruptor in our hobby. And I'm going to take you guys back in time because I think context is everything. And I think what the Buick Grand National means to our hobby today, is very different from what it meant back in the day. Your buddy CJ is a Gen Xer. Okay, I was a child of the 1980s. I don't mind telling you that. And I think it's important that we talk about when this Grand National hit the streets and the Buick Regal T-Type, the Turbo Regals, we're going to get into that too. Based on that G-body platform, it was a disruptor. The car didn't mean back then what it means to us today. Now, I promise I'm not speaking in code. I'm not trying to play games. Guys, we're going to get right into it, but I want to set some of that context. I do want to get into some of the specs about this vehicle. And lastly, I want to talk about what killed the Buick Grand National, because it may not be what you think. Let's be real. Let's talk about it. So guys, let's go ahead and get into it. And first things first, what are we talking about here? Let's take a look at the Buick Grand National during the peak. So here it is, the hero car, the Buick Grand National. Guys, we're going to really kind of go back in time, but I kind of wanted to start things off by taking a look at this thing. The sleek black styling, the blacked out look, okay? On a car that was never intended to be. It was just so wrong in so many ways. It was never intended to be a performance car. Real talk, Buick Regal was your grandfather's car or your uncle's car before the Grand Nationals and the turbos hit the street. Yeah, there were a couple of instances of guys hot rodding them, whatever. I know NASCAR was using them, but your average Regal on the street was driven by like your uncle or your aunt, or maybe, someone cruising around town getting groceries. Like, that's what the G-bodies were in large part. The vast, vast majority of this General Motors G-body platform, that's the underlying platform from General Motors. And the Regal specifically, the Buick brand, was like a geezer's car. No offense, Buick guys, but that's just the way it was. As a car guy, taking you back in time as a Gen Xer, that's a big part of the lore and the allure, perhaps, of this car was that it just didn't make sense for a whole lot of reasons. It was disruptive, okay? Not to mention what's under the hood. It's not a V8, okay? It's not a 350, the turbocharged V6. Buick was ahead of its time, but the story predates the 1980s when this thing hit the streets, as you're seeing it in this image. So let's go ahead and talk about a bit of the history and where the Grand National story really begins. Guys, a couple things to know and for us to talk about together. 1960s, 1970s, in the United States and beyond, for the most part, performance cars for your average automotive enthusiast meant V8. Hard stop. Now, were there non V8 based performance cars? Yes, there were. Of course, there were. Not going to argue on that point. But the vast, vast majority of performance cars, and when we thought about the standard, the benchmark for high performance in the 1980s, being fed on what we'd what our automotive enthusiast hobby had grown up on in the 1960s and 1970s, particularly in the United States, you're talking about the muscle car era. There's no replacement for displacement. We're talking about the V8, okay? 8 cylinders. That was the most desirable platform from a performance standpoint, okay? And, there's just been this long-standing heritage of, particularly, we're going to talk about American performance cars, North America, Camaro, Chevelle, Mustang, GTO, Challenger, Charger, all the big Mopar stuff, okay? Corvettes. We're talking about a formula. And that formula is comprised of Detroit iron, including a V8 out front and rear wheel drive. Now, put a pin in that for a moment. The other realm, if you will, European exotics, some of the Japanese cars that started to emerge, right? Porsche 911 was kind of the other end of the continuum. You had the flat six rear engine, the turbos, the Widowmakers, the Whale Tails. Those are super high performance cars. So again, as an automotive enthusiast, going back in time, not by today's standards, but going back in time to the early to mid 1980s, before that Grand National hit the streets, we're kind of trained on what high performance cars look like. Not only the Porsche, what about the Ferrari? Okay. What about the Lamborghini? The Italian exotics? Okay. What about some of the emerging BMWs, the early M cars? Okay, when we think about performance back then, that's what performance cars looked like. Either that or it was a muscle car. Look, I was there. I'm telling you. Guys, leave me comments. Let me know if you had a different experience. I want to set this stage because I think it's important. Context is everything. In order to really understand the significance and the history of the Grand National, we got to understand the era that this car hit the streets in. And if you don't think the Grand National was the great disruptor to the automotive hobby, redefining the way we thought about American performance cars, redefining what a muscle car could be, those assumptions, you're way off. You're really missing the point. Because I think, guys, when we think about modern day, just the past 10 to 15 years, we are so spoiled as car guys. I always say, stop complaining, car guys. Yeah, there's EVs, there's a push towards hybrid and all these other things. But let me tell you something. We live in unprecedented times as automotive enthusiasts. We are so fortunate to have access to every form, platform, architecture, combination of performance car that you could ever imagine. From wild 4-cylinder twin turbos, V6 twin turbos, hybrid platforms, all-wheel drive. I don't want to get sidetracked here. Okay? But these are extremely diverse and exciting times where you can have the pick of the litter for any type of performance car and platform. The definition of performance car is wide, it is broad, and it is deep. I'll say it again. The definition of performance car in 2024 is wide, broad, and deep, and extremely diverse. There's a whole continuum of performance cars. Now stop. Let's go back in time. 1980, 1982, 1985. There was not a terribly wide and deep definition of performance car. It was actually quite narrow in pockets. Okay? And I'm going to focus on North America and the United States. The definition of performance car was all the things that I mentioned. Okay? So that's setting the stage. Muscle cars, exotic cars. That was kind of it. There were gaps, right? But there were very hard lines defining a performance car. You know, you didn't have a lot of super high performance sedans back in the day, or big, heavy family cruisers that were also super high performance. There may have been a few exceptions here and there, but for the most part, they would leverage one of those platforms I mentioned, either a super muscle car oriented platform, V8 rear wheel drive, or one of the exotic cars, okay? So let's keep going. Did you know, and here, let's take a look at something together. The Genesis, the great-grandfather to our beloved Buick Grand National, is this car. What are we looking at here? 1976 Indianapolis 500 pace car. Okay? 1976. It's a Buick Century. It's a boat. It's a gigantic old school Buick. Guess what's under the hood of this 1976 Buick Century? It's not a V8. It is a turbo V6 engineered by Buick. 1976. So the important thing to know here is that the history and lineage of what we know as the Buick Grand National can be traced way back to the 1970s. Okay? Think about 1970s America, the oil crisis, embargo. For those that aren't old enough to remember, hell, I'm hardly old enough to remember. I was young. I was an itty-bitty automotive enthusiast. But in all seriousness, guys, smog pumps, emissions, catalytic converters, these things were killing the muscle car era. And during the peak of it, and maybe with a bit of foresight, and there's kind of some lore behind how Buick, you know, kind of a pet project. I don't even want to get into it. Kind of a pet project, kind of off the books. Some Buick folks working on this V6 turbo, and then it became something of interest to Buick executives. And then before you know it, hey, can we put that V6 turbo in a pace car? And can we make it work? And they did it. 1976 Indianapolis 500. This car was the first V6 pace car for the Indianapolis 500. This car was not making big horsepower, okay? Again, big old American muscle car platform with a V6 turbo. I wish I could have been there. I wish I could go back in time. Can you imagine the reaction from folks, automotive enthusiasts at that 1976 Indianapolis 500? What was their reaction to that V6 turbo Buick? Okay, but it was an indication of things to come. Because, and we're talking about the history and the lineage of the Grand National, if that 1976 pace car was the grandfather, let's talk about the first production Buick with the V6 turbo. Come on, this will be perhaps the older brother. Look at this. 1978 Buick Regal Sport Coupe. Now, take a look at this car, guys, and be honest. Is there anything about this car that screams performance, motorsports, okay? Cool? No, not at all. This car is not cool. This car does not have a motorsports vibe, okay? This is not a car you'd want to be cruising around town on Friday night or Saturday night. You would not want to take this car to the drag strip or run it light to light. No. Come on, guys. This was your grandfather's car. 1978 Buick Regal Sport Coupe, right? But hold on. Why is your buddy CJ showing you this car? Look closely at the hood. This car was available in 1978 with the 3.8 liter turbo. That's what we're looking at here. Now, let me tell you something. 150 to 165 horsepower. Aesthetics and appearance of, a family car, or maybe your aunt's car. When she would come over on Easter, she would drive her Buick Regal Sport Coupe, especially in this color. But there's a significance here. This is the older brother to your Buick Grand National, make no mistake. G-body platform, okay? With that V6, 3.8 liter, with a turbo. I remember seeing these cars on the road, people. I remember seeing that bulge in the hood. No, I don't remember seeing them back in 78. I was just, your buddy CJ was an itty-bitty guy. But later on, I remember seeing these around, and this was before the internet, and before you could just do a lot of research on cars. I said, wow, they put the turbo in those old Buick Regals? Yes, they did. Not just the 1976 pace car. How many of you actually knew about that pace car? Be honest. But the 1978 Regal. Are you kidding me? 6 years before the real Grand National came out. Years before. This goes back, this was the first American turbo since like the Corvair. That's going back a ways, right? So turbo production cars were not really a thing before this 1978 Regal came out. But maybe a blip on the radar. I mean, it's not like that. When was the last time somebody said to you, boy, I'd really like to have a 1978 Regal Sport Coupe with that turbo in green or in like white with a Landau top? No. That was an old person car back in the day. Come on, your buddy CJ keeping it real. That was a nerd car. We having fun tonight, guys. But in all seriousness, that's a bit of the history. Things got interesting in 1982. Come on. Let's look at this together, guys. What are we looking at here? The first Buick Grand National. 1982. They didn't make a lot of these cars, guys, okay? First things first. And for the most part of significance, this was really an appearance package. Hear me out. There wasn't much of a performance component to this car. It looks pretty cool. Notice it doesn't have the fully blacked out appearance yet. What we're talking about is the two-tone silver with the black. Look at the wheels, kind of cool. The decals, okay, right? They didn't make that many. Still collectible, I would tend to say. I'd like to have one. But the performance numbers are going to underwhelm you. Most of these cars actually had a 4.1 liter V6 naturally aspirated. I didn't say turbo. 4.1 liter V6, and they were lame. Okay? They were lame, okay? About 35 of these cars had the 3.8 liter turbo, making 175 horsepower, 275 foot-pounds of torque. Now, that was an upgrade over the 4.1 liter naturally aspirated V6, which only made about 125 horsepower. These V6s were not performance engines. Keep in mind the context here, guys. Context is everything. We live in bizarro times. We live in wild times in many ways, don't we? Where just about any car you could imagine can have a factory hot rod, can have super high performance Toyota Camrys with 300 horsepower. What are you kidding me? Base BMW 3 Series that are scorchers, base Dodge Chargers that are fast, right? 4-cylinder Mustangs, ridiculous. These are bizarre times. compared to back then. If you went back in time, okay, and told people that like a Toyota Camry 30 years down the road, 40 years down the road, whatever, would have 300 horsepower, people look at you like you had two heads. None of us would have believed you. Okay? If you would tell people that there'd be like high performance pickup trucks and SUVs with 400, 500 horsepower, yeah, right. What are you smoking? Okay? Those V6s were produced for emissions, for efficiency, okay? In the era of the oil crisis, changing consumer appetite. The objective was never, hey, let's blow it out and make a super wild high performance car, a legendary muscle car. That wasn't really the objective, if we look back in reality. Okay? That may have been the outcome. We'll get to that in a moment. I also want to pause here and take a look at something else that I think is super interesting that kind of got us to this point. And remember, we're at the 1982 Grand National. Can we really talk about the Buick Grand National without talking about what Darrell Waltrip did in NASCAR? 1981, 1982, his incredible championship runs with what? The Buick Regal. Now, this is in the days of real stock car racing, okay? And the term Grand National, did you know, has significance in motorsports in the United States, okay? And specifically in NASCAR. Your buddy CJ doesn't claim to know everything about NASCAR. Leave me comments if you guys have additional information you'd like to share. Start a dialogue on it. The point being that, what's the old saying? Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. That was a thing with the big Detroit automakers, right? Because a big part of why Buick, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler Corporation, a big part of why they played such a huge role and invested so much in motorsports, and still, for the most part, not all of them, continue to, is because it sells cars. It sells product, marketing, brand, promotion. And that continues to be true today, whether it's F1 or Indy cars, you name it, NASCAR. What a wild, wild run Darrell Waltrip had with his Buick Regals. That played a part in the development of the Grand National. Of course it did. Okay, so let's mention that. Guys, for 1983, there was no Grand National. I think that 1982 car, not much to get excited about other than being a bit of a homologation car and interesting to look at. Okay, that wasn't setting any land speed records. That wasn't, eclipsing Porsche 911s or Ferraris or Corvettes of the era. That was still like your uncle's car or your grandfather's car. Okay, under the hood, really, from a net performance standpoint. Things got interesting in 1984. Now we're talking. Come on, guys. Let's take a look at this. 1984 Buick Grand National. In 1984, the Buick Grand National, as the icon that we all know and think of today, was born. In 84, we had the black motif going with those mag wheels. Okay, I love those hurricane wheels, as I call them. I call them hurricane wheels. I don't know what Buick officially called them. A lot of my buddies and we all called them hurricane wheels. If you're a Buick Grand National guy, you got one of these cars, leave me comments. Blacked out, sinister, with what under the hood? The 3.8 liter V6 turbo. 1984, fuel injected, 200 horsepower, but perhaps more significantly, 300 foot-pounds of torque. Okay? Quarter mile was close to that of a Corvette. Okay? You're talking about a Garrett turbo, Bosch fuel injection. Okay? Low 14-second quarter mile. They made about 2,000 of these cars, I believe, guys. Okay. And, with the Grand National, this is kind of where I want to talk about and press the pause button here for a moment. How disruptive this car was. This car didn't make sense. I remember your buddy CJ is going to tell a quick story. Come on, I got to look you in the eye for this one. I remember in the 1980s distinctly seeing Buick Grand Nationals on the road for the first time, and my first reaction was, "What is that?" Whoa. Because, you would see Camaro, Porsche, RX-7, Corvette, Mustang. You'd see them all day. We'd go buy Hot Rod Magazine, Motor Trend, Car and Driver, sit at the bus stop waiting to go to school, looking at what we knew to be a performance car. Enter the Grand National. Doesn't make sense. It blew our minds. Mind equals blown. I got to be real with you. That platform, G-body platform, Buick Regal, your aunt's car, your grandmother's car, granddad's pop's car, as a performance car in a sinister paint scheme, putting up big performance numbers, right up there with the Corvette. Do you know how disruptive that was? Do you know how wild that was? The other thing I'll say, you didn't see a lot of them. It's not like, you go to a Cars and Coffee, if it's big enough, or a car show, you're going to see Grand Nationals now. Okay, they're somewhat scarce, I know, but there's going to be like a concentration. Maybe you get sick and tired of seeing them. Back then, it was like, whoa, that guy's got a Grand National. If you were a car guy, a young car guy back then, these cars captured your imagination. These cars caught your eye. Why? Because it didn't make sense. I don't know how many times I have to say that tonight. I hope it sinks in. Because when we think of the Grand National today, it's the muscle car icon of the 80s. No, it wasn't. When this car hit the streets, that was somebody's abuelo's car. Come on. That was an old man car in a new form. So a little bit of humor, I know, or at least an attempt. But I think context is everything. I think over the decades and over the years, sometimes we lose the context, right? 1985 was a continuation year of the Grand National. Very similar, if not identical spec from 1984. Things got interesting in 1986. Come on, let's take a look at the 1986 Grand National together, guys. 1986 Buick Grand National had gains. Let me tell you something. We're talking about 10% more power. We're up to 235 horsepower, about 330 foot-pound of torque, which was big and significant for the 1980s, especially for a Buick Regal G-body platform. Are you kidding me? This car could hang with any performance car of this era. It was just so disruptive, and it was based on the G-body platform. Absolutely incredible. We're talking about high 13-second quarter mile, okay, stock. Now, these cars would run, a base Buick Regal in this era was like $11,500. You added $3,500, $4,000, something like that for the Grand National option. Grand National was a trim package, was an option package, right? Including that 3.8 liter V6. They moved the turbo out front. They changed the intake manifold. They added an intercooler, okay? And basically we're able to get that additional horsepower bump. 235 horsepower, 330 foot-pounds of torque. So 1986 was a big performance year for the Buick Grand National. Guys, let's keep going and let's take a look at some of the other significant attributes that I think are super important to the Grand National. Now, maybe something that doesn't get spoken about a lot when we talk about the Grand National. I think everybody first wants to talk about the 3.8 liter turbo V6, which is important. Of course it is. That's the heartbeat of this car. How about the interior? Buick was just below Cadillac in General Motors luxury stack. So you had Cadillac, then you had Buick right below it, then you had Pontiac, okay? And then all the way down at the bottom, we had Chevrolet. I guess I forgot Oldsmobile. Oldsmobile was up there too, right? So I guess you had Cadillac, Oldsmobile, Buick. Now listen, Pontiac, Chevy. That's how I would stack them. Let me know if you'd stack them any different. Point being, the key point here is that Buick was very high on the luxury scale for General Motors. You paid a premium for Buick. Look at the interior. This was a plush interior for the 1980s. Now, if you compare it by today's standards to a Mercedes or today's Cadillac or whatever, yeah, completely different, right? Like, don't even go there. But for this era, you got a lot of luxury in here. The guy who bought this car in the 80s was not like your average Mustang buyer, okay? This car was priced out of the market for a lot of guys. Okay, this was an expensive car in that era, okay? You know, your average guy is going to go out and buy a Camaro, you know, or a Mustang or an RX-7, was not springing for a Grand National back then. You just did not see many on the road. They were limited production, okay? And they were expensive. But look at that interior, right? It was a bit plush, okay? You had a bench seat in the rear. You had those two buckets up front. These cars did have a torque converter, old school automatic transmission. These cars were not available as manuals, and still got all that performance out of them for the era. Guys, that's a little bit about the interior. I want to take a look. I want to pop the hood tonight with you guys. Come on, let's pop the hood of that Grand National. Let's take a look at the engine bay. So underneath the hood of the Buick Grand National, and you can clearly see front and center towards the left of this image, you can see the turbo with the shroud over it, okay? And you can see some of the plumbing, the snorkels, and you can see the high pressure side of the turbo going right into the induction system down the center line of the engine, okay? So looking under the hood, you see a lot of General Motors parts bin stuff. Like I had a couple of G-bodies back in the day. I did not have a Grand National. They all looked a lot like this, with the exception of the Grand National kit, you know, including that turbo and that induction system and that fuel injection system. But underneath it, if we stripped it all away, that 3.8 liter Buick V6. Now, I had a 1983 Pontiac Grand Prix with one of these stock V6s in it. The 3.8 liter naturally aspirated. What was it, 100 horsepower? 112? 125? For a car as heavy as a G-body, 1983 Pontiac Grand Prix, the car was underpowered. That car, for me, struggled to accelerate uphill. It was probably a good car for a very young teenage CJ to have. It was a safe car, and well, not by today's standards, but by the standards back then. Kudos to my dad for thinking of me and kind of encouraging me to buy that car because it was safe and sane. I think if you had asked me at the time I wanted a Monte Carlo SS, I knew I couldn't afford a Grand National. But, you know, again, the point being, that G-body platform was not primarily known as a performance car. And the V6 was almost laughable before the Grand National Turbo came out. A couple other things I want to talk about, guys. Are we having fun? Leave me those comments because I know I'm having a great time. Hopefully you guys are too. What discussion about the Buick Grand National is complete without talking about the T-Type Regal? You can't talk about the Buick Grand National without talking about the Buick Regal T-Type, which was a Buick Regal available in various colors, not just the sinister black. This is not a Grand National. However, it's got the same drivetrain and specifically the power plant as the Grand National, 3.8 liter turbo. The main difference is you could get the Regal T-Type in other colors. Now, to me, the Regal T-Type is a sleeper. The Grand National is not a sleeper. Don't let people tell you the Grand National is a sleeper. If people think the Buick Grand National is a sleeper, they're wrong. Absolutely incorrect. The Regal T-Type was the sleeper from the 80s. We all knew what a Grand National was. Everybody on the streets who was a car guy, when you saw a Grand National, once word got out, you knew it was a super high performance car for the era. The Regal T-Type, a lot of people didn't know about the Regal T-Type. They were sleeping on the Regal T-Type. They didn't know that it had a Grand National sitting under the hood. Let me tell you something else. State troopers in Connecticut had Buick Regal T-Types. Who remembers that? And it wasn't just Connecticut. I'm sure other state troopers across the country and other municipalities may have had Buick Regal T-Types. But if you grew up in Connecticut, you one of my boys out there from back in the day, you remember Connecticut state troopers with the T-Type Regals. Are you kidding me? These cars are collectible. I'll be honest with you. Your buddy CJ would probably rather have a T-Type Regal than a Grand National. Grand National, listen, I love Grand Nationals. I grew up loving Grand Nationals. But for me, I always like to be a bit different. You know your buddy CJ is a bit different. Come on. I like the T-Type Regals, but that's just me. Guys, let's keep going. All right. All good things must come to an end. But when it comes to the Buick Grand National, the end came with a big crescendo. We're talking about the 1987 Buick Grand National GNX edition, including a tuned and refined 3.8 liter V6 turbo by ASC McLaren. So these Buick Grand Nationals, limited to some 547 GNX models. The GNX trims, those cars, all the GNXs, they ended up going to ASC McLaren for final tuning, okay, on that engine. And that included 276 horsepower and about 360 foot-pounds of torque. The suspension was stiffened, okay? Larger wheels, larger rubber, fender flares. Look at the vents in the front fender. Included electronic programming and ECU tune for the day. Ceramic coated impeller on the turbo. Okay. Newly engineered intercooler and upgraded exhaust, to name a few things. So this car, super collectible now, limited to some 547. And why the weird number? Because some dealers, if they achieved certain performance metrics, they were entitled to 2 allocations. It was originally going to be 500. They ended up making, I believe, 547 of these cars. Super highly collectible. Now, Buick was known for putting more juice in their press cars, or anytime one of their cars were tested, especially Grand Nationals, GNX, Grand National, whatever, from this era, they did wild performance numbers. But, you know, this car was smoking pretty much anything on the road. Come on. You know, whether it was Ferrari, Corvette, you name it, Porsches, you know, straight line anyway, Buick GNX could do it, you know. So this was really the precipice, if you will, the ultimate Buick Grand National. As I mentioned, pushing 276 horsepower, 360 foot-pounds of torque. And guys, this was a bit of the swan song. They made in total about 20,000 Buick Grand Nationals in 1987. But that was it. You know, after 1987, that was really the end. And you might say to yourself, why? You know, if there was this interest, um, back in the day in unique performance cars, and they sold out every Grand National they made, especially the G and X's. I imagine some of them sat on lots, the T types, and maybe some of the Grand Nationals were on dealership lots for a while, but they sold, right? The times were a changing. What killed the Buick Grand National? Well, what really killed the Buick Grand National was innovation in the automotive industry, new regulation and requirements. That G body platform, that Buick Regal, Chevy Monte Carlo, Pontiac Grand Prix, Oldsmobile Cutlass, okay? All those cars, they're based on that G body platform that goes back decades. Decades. The G body, the A body, okay? You're talking about legacy technology. So when that last Grand National rolled off the assembly line in 87, there was a new era, a new platform just waiting to go. So what killed the Buick Grand National? I'll show you right now. I'm not shy. 1988 killed the Buick Grand National. And I'm not hating, but let's be real, guys. What are we looking at here? This is a 1988 Buick Regal. Now, this happens to be a pretty cool spec in hindsight, but this car has nothing to do with the 1987 Buick Regal. This car has nothing in common with a 1987 Buick Regal. This is what's known as the W platform from General Motors. You know, Pontiac had one, Chevy had one, Oldsmobile had one. This is the Buick. This is the Regal. We're talking about front wheel drive. The era of front wheel drive was upon us in the United States. So gone was the G body platform. So if you had to ask me what killed the Monte Carlo SS, the Buick Grand National, all those cars, it was innovation and evolution. It was, evolving safety and emissions requirements. While the V6 platform did so many incredible things in those legacy architectures, such as the G body, there's only so much you could do, right? GM continuing to evolve. And what a disappointment it was. I do remember when I started, and I was a Pontiac Grand Prix driver in this era, so to speak. And as a very young man and an automotive enthusiast, I remember when I saw like my first Pontiac Grand Prix coming out in 1988, 1989, when they started to really hit the streets. And I was disappointed. It didn't have that cool factor, what I perceived as a cool factor in my Grand Prix, because my Grand Prix kind of had the same body lines as the Monte Carlo SS, even though I didn't have the performance. And it kind of had the same silhouette as the Buick Regal Grand National, even though it didn't have the same performance. But, the W platform cars had nothing in common with my Pontiac Grand Prix or the Monte Carlo SS, which I loved so dearly. The Hurst Olds, maybe for another episode, we'll talk about the Hurst Olds Cutlass, or of course, the Buick Grand National. So guys, let's take a moment to acknowledge the significance, the history of the Buick Grand National. I wanted to share sort of my perspective, not just some of the history, which I think is kind of cool, of the Buick Grand National, and hopefully you guys enjoyed this as much as I did, but also kind of my experience as a Gen Xer, as a lifelong car guy, and what it meant to me, to CJ, as a young car dude growing up. When I first saw my first Buick Grand Nationals, are you kidding me? In the streets. And how disruptive it was, how wild, and how it made absolutely no sense. And now, today in 2024, the Buick Grand National is the icon of 80s muscle car performance. In hindsight, of course, it's carrying the banner for the 80s. Go, 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 Buick Grand National, right? But when that Grand National first hit the streets, it took a while to get over the shock and awe. It was disruptive. And over the years, we just love them, don't we? I think the Buick Grand National and the GNX so limited, super high collectible car. But I think we can all agree that we love the iconic Grand Nationals, can't we? Whether you a JDM guy or a European exotics car guy or a Ford Mustang guy, we all got to agree there's something about that mystique of the blacked out Buick Grand National that still is alive and well today. So, guys, that's about it on the Buick Grand National for tonight. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. You know your buddy CJ loves you. Give me a like and subscribe. And until I speak to you on the next one, peace.